You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority. But the state is still formidable. Or is it? You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society. Let's dive headfirst into The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, my guest on the show is Philip, who goes by his pen name, Philip Bodeswell. Philip, welcome to The White Pill Box.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Folks, Philip is proud of his lifelong commitment to political liberty, and he values independence, especially in thought. He's got a fascinating background, and this is just a sampling. He has degrees, or the equivalent, in sports history, computer science, and law. He's a United Kingdom qualified barrister. He's done contract IT development and project management from within the matrix, as he says. Check it out. He's also done stand-up comedy in London. And some real serious stuff too. For example, he was imprisoned for refusing masking during COVID. And then, folks, there's the big topic I want to spend time on today, and that's his highly interesting and unique work, an online publication called The Narcissist State. The link is thenarcissiststate.net. That's all one word. He has a Substack too, which I'll link to, and he's also on Twitter, X, at Narcissist State. That's one word as well. Of course, the show notes will have all of that and even more info about Philip. So, Philip, let's get to it. The Narcissist State. How would you describe the work at sort of the highest level, like maybe a couple of paragraph elevator pitch?
So I looked at became involved in trying to understand how narcissism works, what it is, and that was from a personal perspective. And it has certain features that are well documented in the world of psychology, and that is that there are certain roles that are assigned, and there are certain mechanisms that operate that together serve to control the perceptions of the various people who are involved. And over some time, I put that together with my experience of politics, which is lifelong, experience of and interest in. And I noticed a lot of parallels, and it got to the point where I felt I really had to document it because it seemed to be a very clear pattern to me. So I put it together in a framework and subjected the framework to as much analysis and research as I could do, testing the ideas, and decided to publish it online. I made some adjustments to it as it was online, and I could do that. And then the idea was really to get it out there and see what kind of reaction I got to it. So there are certain roles that are characterized as a golden child, an enabler, a scapegoat, a lost or invisible child, a flying monkey, and there are certain mechanisms which are in role allocation is one of the mechanisms, gaslighting, intermittent reinforcement, love bombing, narcissistic rage itself, something called DAVO, which means deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender, and that's most of them. Of course, they're all documented in the framework. There's about 8 of them, and then how they all come together, they in synthesis, and effectively operate as a system in a way that can make it difficult to sort of see your way through what's actually happening and how the sort of the wall is being pulled over your eyes effectively by what emerges as a relatively sophisticated system. And it can be distracting to think that you can think your way out of the system with, let's say, intellectual arguments, sophisticated philosophies, and so forth. You actually might be caught in something that's coming from a different angle. And I found applying that to the broader world of politics and the issues that we all look at and face was a very interesting project for me. And so I was very motivated to put it together, put my thoughts together, and put them out there to the world and to see what people made of it.
This is fairly new, right? How old? When would you say it was posted, like sort of officially in a form that you were comfortable with? How recent was that?
Yeah, at the end of last year, sort of November time, I started. So it had taken me a few months to write up the framework, and then at around November time, I published it on the Reddit forums, and published it online, and started up the Substack. So those activities have been just, well, really since sort of October, November last year.
So it's barely a few months old. So I wouldn't think there's been enough time probably as yet to have gotten much feedback. In particular, I'd be most interested in knowing if you've gotten feedback from psychological experts, people familiar with this area.
So there was one comment on the Reddit that somebody said that they were a psychologist and of some kind, whether they were psychiatrists, I'm not sure exactly what they said. And they said, "Oh, I've been having very similar thoughts along these lines." That was a comment essentially. That was it. And there were also YouTube producers. Maria Kolova is one that I think is quite close to essentially having the same ideas, but she hasn't presented it in the same way. So another one is Professor Vatnik, and viewers may or may not be familiar with him, but Professor Vatnik, a very sophisticated disseminator of psychological information, especially in relation to narcissism. And I believe he's got quite close to coming to these conclusions. He may already have done so, but if he has, he's published them in academic environments. And in my research, I found it hard to discover anybody who's really presented it in the same way that I have, which is more sort of getting it out there to the public, and in a way that I, as a member of the public, rather than a psychological professional, see as useful and relatively easy to digest. To answer your question a bit more directly, the psychological community is not the one that it's interesting what their perspective is, but what I'm saying from their perspective is relatively standard knowledge. It's well established over the last 50 years or so, and none of it comes as a surprise to them. What's different is the way that they've taken those ideas and applied them in the broader societal political context. And I think it's particularly relevant to political outliers like us.
Yes, that's one of the major takeaways I had from it. For the sake of the folks, could you pick out one or two of the classic, let's say, narcissist behaviors? Explain it how you might see it in a household, a family, a work environment, which would connect for most people directly with personal experiences, perhaps a coworker. And then, if you don't mind, paralleling that with how the state exhibits that same behavior.
Yeah. So, well, one of the major features is gaslighting, which can seem like a somewhat obscure term initially. There's a film made in the 40s that's really there to help us understand what the term means. So that film involves a man who essentially wants to defraud his wife, but he decided to do it. But the way that he goes about doing it is by disorientating her and making it so that she questions her own perceptions. And he does a number of things to do this, one of which is fraternizing too much with the maid, with the helper. But the thing that he does that is the title of the film is derived from is he dims the gas that they use for the lighting in the house. So if she's sitting there reading a book, the lights will dim, and just enough to make her notice, and then they'll go back up again. And it's what the film's bringing out is the subtlety of this behavior, the way that she sort of doubts her perceptions, and she becomes increasingly disorientated and confused, and she doesn't trust her own perception of the world around her is the objective. And this phenomenon plays out in a billion different ways, and it can be very well refined to a particular circumstance. So if you're a psychologist and you analyze a particular family, you would have to go into some detail about how the dynamics work before you started to pick up, okay, here we've got gaslighting, here we've got a distortion of perception that's taking place that works according to how that family works. So it can be very specific. But because it's specifically tailored to the psychology and the dynamics of that particular family, it's particularly effective on the victim, as it were, on the target of the gaslighting. And it's also very difficult for that person to complain, as it were, and to point out that this is being done to them, because it's specific to that environment. It sounds like nonsense when you take it out to the rest of the world. You complain to somebody else about it, for example. This gaslighting process takes place, and it's tailored to the circumstances. So if we level it up, the example I like to use is inflation. We have all experienced, the headlines telling us that inflation is under control, or inflation is at sort of 2%, something like this. And when we go to the supermarket, we find that eggs have gone up by 20% in the last 2 weeks. Obviously, that can be short-term price fluctuations, but it sort of underlines the way that we absorb information that comes to us from the world around us, and it feeds into the information that we get from other guests that you have, people like James Corbett and others who look at a lot at how the propaganda actually functions. But whenever I hear these stories about how we're getting a distorted vision of the world from the mainstream media, and also a lot of confusion in the community, the way that people are interpreting information according to their own ideological background and their values and so forth, we collectively become quite gaslighted, and a lot of us kind of are not entirely sure what to think. And I can, in a sense, I could use myself as an example here. I look at Austrian school theory of money, and for example, and it's really quite a technical topic. And every speaker that you get will insist that it's simple. If only you adopt their way of looking at the problem, money becomes simple. But as soon as they start getting into the details, you get more and more confused and more unsure of just exactly what is money. And then you try and apply those theories to what you're hearing in relation to inflation or any other monetary policies that we hear through the mainstream sources. And the net effect is we get gaslighted. And of course, it isn't a one-off thing. I'm talking about a process that impinges upon us throughout our lives. So through the course of our lives, you will be able to identify gaslighting in the public school environment. You will be able to identify it in relation to adolescence. Look at what's going on with all the woke language around, are men men, are women women. So when I see this kind of thing, what 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 occurs to me is gaslighting more than anything else, is this confusion, and it's not an aberration that's happening for some strange unknown reason. It's kind of built into the way the system works. The more that you look into different areas of life and politics, the more you see this pattern emerging. And I know that that can be called, that can, scientists might refer to that as confirmation bias. But I deliberately put, falsification criteria into the framework as a counter to some extent to that accusation of simple, confirmation bias. But what I would invite viewers to do, having read the framework, is to look at ways in which they can see this pattern and the way that it applies to them in their lives, in the way that they look at the political world. And looking at it through it that way, I hope would help to sort of simplify, in a way, uh, how you actually respond to this information. How much time and energy do you devote to certain topics that ultimately are simply going to make you confused, make you disorientated, um, and, um, and make you feel like, okay, I don't agree with a lot of things that are going on, but I don't really know what to do about it, or even what I want to do about it.
One of the things that came out clearly to me, because I think you brought it up several times in the framework, is very important, I think, for especially for someone coming to this new, and that is this narcissistic pattern that you explain is not conspiratorial. It's not trying to say that there are narcissists who occupy powerful positions that are consciously using narcissistic techniques to manipulate you. And while it certainly is highly likely there are a few people like that in positions of power, just like there's people like that in positions outside of politics, that's really not what you're saying. It's that the system itself operates that way naturally by virtue of its very nature. Could you sort of stress that and explain that so the folks don't come into this thinking we're talking about some sort of conspiratorial angle?
Yeah, sure. And I find it fascinating because of my own journey. Uh, I think I was what we call a normie up to around about 2013. Uh, so I thought that Obama was a bit of a non-entity, probably controlled in the background, but at least came across as not sort of dangerously unhinged. Um, and when I look back on that view, I find it kind of incredible that I could had that view. Um, but I started to, come across, first of all, I'm going to forget his name, but the famous conspiracy theorist who was a favorite amongst truckers, and people like David Icke, um, who uh, put out all of this fascinating stuff, which I kind of lapped it up at some point. I don't read books about that kind of thing. I tend to feel that I can glean most of the information I need from those kinds of things from videos and interviews and so forth. Um, and of course, he starts talking about the Queen's a lizard. Now, I mean, I'm all for being open-minded, and I've been skeptical of institutions like the monarchy my whole life. Uh, but to characterize the monarchy as a bunch of lizards, um, and to try and expect people to take that literally, not even as a metaphor, was clearly absurd, and not helpful. And what do you do with that information? I mean, I think unless you can prove it in some form, which nobody has ever been able to do, it's a major distraction. Um, and it's unfortunate because I think he said a lot of very interesting and intelligent things about the state of the world, and even things like the geopolitical environment. But I don't listen to what he has to say on those topics really very much anymore. I'd rather listen to John Mearsheimer, um, and um, and the sort of people that Judge Napolitano has on his show, who in many ways are very much part of the state, like Colonel McGregor, but they give us an alternative narrative. This seems to me to be kind of the level-headed sort of information that helps us to, understand what's going on, and adding a lot of conspiracy stuff that we can't prove. And I came to the conclusion at some point that you don't need to prove it, because if you are not beholden to the state, and you're not concerned about the vast power indifference that exists amongst top politicians relative to the rest of us, you don't need to concern yourself with conspiracy theories. Uh, so it ends up being inadvertently an enormous gaslighting exercise. And I'm sorry to say that about someone like David, who I think's been, incredibly committed to unearthing the truth. And I don't think there's any harm in, reading his books or listening to what he has to say, but it's about putting it into perspective. And it can be really an energy draining rabbit hole to spend too much time and energy on that. Um, and, um, and of course, when James Corbett came along, it was a great relief for me to get away from a lot of the sort of David Icke type of stuff, and into a much more level-headed environment. But at this stage, I think that, and I think James would recognize this to some degree, uh, there's also a great deal of energy that can go into, trying to prove that 9/11 was an inside job. If you ask me, on balance, from everything that I've heard from him and others, I think it is. But I think I heard you say recently, um, I don't know that for absolute certainty, because I'm probably never going to be in a position to find out. So I don't spend my time and energy getting overly upset about that topic. I'm very glad that certain people are pursuing it. But I think if they've managed to keep it under wraps for 20 years, they'll manage to do it for 20 more. And the world of politics moves on, and our world around us moves on. And whilst it would be useful to prove, exactly what did happen on 9/11, it's more useful really just to, use it as a way to be skeptical of the state and not feel that you have to, prove it as in a court, prove it as per a court of law. And there's this tendency in our society to expect everybody to have, such an in-depth knowledge of every topic before, you even have a right to have a view on it. So, you know, going back to inflation again, I can't complain about the price of eggs because I don't really understand inflation properly, or I don't really know what money is. Um, no, at a certain point, you can reassure yourself. No, I can see that this is going on. I don't need to spend more time and energy worrying about this. And you're not abandoning your interest in the world and what's going on around you, but you're more observing it from a more objective point of view. And if you're fitting it into the framework as I have put it forward, you also use it as a way to exit from that system and focus more on ways in which you can bring yourself out of the system, which again is another whole topic, and there are whole blogs devoted to that topic, aren't there? Where people, all the details of how you stay connected online without using mainstream media, how you keep your phone private, how you manage your finances. We all know these issues. So I think keeping on track with those things is a really good thing. But we're all at different stages, and it's too easy to sort of admonish people and say, you ought to be doing this and you ought to be doing that. And I think you need something much more flexible that explains, yeah, you're on a path out of the whole thing. You want to head towards freedom, but you want to do it in your own time and in your own way and according to your own circumstances. And I hope that if you can see what's going on around you using this perspective, it might for some people be a really a helpful way to look at the problem, a new way to look at the problem. Because as you yourself have said, and many others have, we've had 50 years of this. So, we need to start trying something new.
That's such a great lead into one of the things I really wanted to focus on for the folks, and that is that how your framework sort of fits or contrasts with the rest of libertarian literature that attempts to deal with psychology. Now, first of all, there's painfully little in libertarian thinking and scholarship that examines psychology and how psychology fits into all this. And a couple of examples of that, which you're aware of, is Michael Huemer's The Problem of Political Authority, and of course Larkin Rose's The Most Dangerous Superstition. And these are certainly two of my top favorites. But a big sort of heading for this sort of work is that it is descriptive. They explain why political authority is not to be trusted, why it's not justified, why it's socially harmful, etc. Basically, they describe what is from a psychological perspective. They're not intended to be, you might say, action plan oriented. So now your work is also descriptive in the sense that it describes how the state has these narcissistic parallels. And you go deep into that, but it's also highly focused on what to do. It concentrates on the self and how to deal with statism. And in this way, I find it distinctive. You make it relatable by showing the parallels of the state with narcissism, or the type of narcissism we see in the family, or business relationships. I'm assuming that was your intent, was to help the individual and not simply expose your observations.
Yeah. So one of the historical books that is a favorite of mine is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And it really struck me as a history student because we have to wade through a lot of, obscure language and obscure, relatively sort of remote ideas to try and, relate to the times that you're writing about when you're studying history. And his book really stood out to me. It was so straightforward, and it was titled Common Sense. And I really felt transported back in time to that time. And his book deliberately, distilled what must have been, quite intimidating sort of philosophical ideas for the people in America at that time. And he does it so well, so brilliantly distills this. And it's recognized as, an important part of the propaganda, if you like, of the revolution. And so, I always had in the back of my mind the sort of aspiration to produce something that people could read in, a couple of days or so, that they get the essential message without having to, really be more academically inclined and relate to what was being said. So, that was something that was a kind of an influence. I felt I wanted to produce something, that was more pamphlet and accessible. Now, I think Larkin's writing is very accessible, and his book is quite long, but for good reason. He's covering a huge amount of ground. And this is often the case. I think when people think very deeply about something, then they're inclined to want to go through it very thoroughly. And that's the way that we've published in the past. You would spend years perhaps putting together, several volumes, and that's where it ties into writers that we're familiar with, Mises, Hayek. But you have to make quite a commitment. Now, world's changed, and the way that we process information has changed, and there's become this very important need to be able to categorize information very quickly or relatively quickly. What we want is we want to hang on to the depth of the insights without losing everybody by insisting that they read, um, you know, a relatively academic, perhaps impenetrable work for most people. Well, I say for most people, I mean, I've looked at a lot of academic writing in my lifetime. And, I know that I really have to sit down and concentrate hard for a long time to, 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 to glean anything useful really from some of the more, in-depth texts. Certainly, Mises, for example. Um, so the question I ask myself is, can I, draw on my experience and what relatively little I know from an academic perspective, and do something, similar that has the same effect? And I was sort of pushed into it by circumstance. So it wasn't by design. It was because I came across this psychological framework that I realized the connections, and that then, you know, that was kind of like the moment that I realized I can do what I've always wanted to do, really, is produce something short, accessible, but that retains all the value from the past. And of course, from looking at the framework that it certainly doesn't take away from what those other writers have done. It very much builds on top of what they've done, and it's a very small part of the entire equation. So the analogy I use is, it's like the cherry on the top of the cake, and it is it's a relatively simple and easy thing to add to something that's much more substantial, which is all of the academic background and all of the work. And they have entities like the Mises Institute, um, which is fantastic, and you have to have that. And those guys are amazing. And I would be somebody who would sit in the audience and listen to Bob Murphy lecture me on money, because he can do it, and I would enjoy that and benefit from it. But I'm not in a position to do that, and I'm not inclined to enter into the debate and be able to contribute to that particular debate in a meaningful way. So I've taken it from another tangent. I realized that I had two sort of areas that most people don't really involve themselves in because they don't feel they have a need to: psychology and politics, and particularly our kind of politics, politics of freedom. And so I found that when I married the two together, like you say, there was relatively small amount of information out there, and authors like Michael Huemer have touched on it, and I'm sure many others have. But what I hope to do was kind of bring it all together into something that is understood, and that can be synthesized.
I'm struck because there's a bit of a parallel, not perfect, with my own work. In my case, I wanted to have digestible podcast episodes, but I was also inspired to do a series on the myth of political authority, mainly because no one else seemed to have done it. But I really didn't know where it was going to lead. At the beginning of it, I sort of assumed that it would lead to better strategies for communicating. Halfway through, I found that that was not at all what it was destined to be about. As I learned and understood the psychology of the myth and how it manifests and how it impacts the actual bullies of the state or the people or whatever it is, I learned along the way. And so I sort of course corrected until I came to the conclusion that, wow, the transition to a free society has begun precisely because the myth of political authority has begun the slow process of erosion, with the myth being the fundamental root cause of the state. If the root cause of something is eroding, the thing is eroding. Not parallel, not perfectly in kind, but it cannot stand without its root. And that insight for me didn't crystallize till halfway through this series. And so anyone who's at least familiar with it will see that course correction, that change of perspective as I learned along the way. That's sort of the downside of doing it in real time along the way. You learn and you might actually have to change the content. With a book, you could write it all ahead of time and do all the research. But I didn't want to do that because I wanted to have content deliverable. In your case, though, you really did do the work. You really did produce pretty much a completed project, which to me is awesome.
Thank you. I would like to say as well, you really do in life, as it were, in my experience, have to get out there and try things. And that's true in the political domain. So I think if you're younger and you're watching this, what you've done, Mark, is brilliant, because I think that you've kind of opened a portal that is relatively accessible. I enjoyed your series on the myth of the state, and I agree that it's an important thing that needs to be gone through thoroughly, and you did that. And I see what I've done as something that comes after that, that primarily anyway, and that sort of helps to open the portal up even further, so that once you've kind of stepped through that portal, the journey is not quite as hazardous as it might otherwise be, because it's no small thing to stand up to the state, and you come under enormous pressure. And I, I feel that there are both sides. You've got to. We have this chicken and egg in our community, that people that get it, and then the tendency is that we're all going to talk to each other in an echo chamber and agree with each other on things that we already agree on. And then we talk about how do you draw people from outside of that in, and it's difficult. It's two-sided, and what you really have to do is get out there and do it. And people will make their own connections in their own time. And so I think what you do does that, and I'm hoping that what I've done might help some people do that, in a slightly different way as well.
And your particular way is, like I said, unique. You're drawing the attention of the reader to the manipulative tactics of narcissism, whether they're intentional or not. And again, it doesn't appear to be intentional in the case of the state. It's just systemic to that particular arrangement, a political arrangement. You draw their attention to that. So that's the first step, is being cognizant of it, aware of it. But you don't stop there. And here again, this is what is very distinctive about your psychological analysis. You then take it to the next step and say, okay, how is this useful for you personally as an individual? How are you made more healthy inside? How you're not just merely acknowledging the bad behavior, but you're understanding how exit is a very important strategy. We have to come back always, I think, in your framework, to how it would work if it were happening to you in a household or in an office. If you had a narcissist around you, in particular in a household or a relationship, the right strategy is exiting as much as you can from the toxicity of that relationship. And you parallel this directly with the human effort, or the suggestion, let's say, that you find ways to exit from the state as best you can. I'd like you to spend a little time on what you might call exit strategies and examples of what we might think of as exit strategies, so that people have some specifics they can focus in on.
Yeah, so I mean, let's say somebody has a corporate job. I've had a corporate job in the past, and you've decided that you're going to pack up and go to New Hampshire for all the reasons that we understand. But you live in London, and you're working there. You've got a family. You come from a family background that had never questioned the state in any way, shape, or form. You go to work. You in the office. You sit around at lunchtime chatting with others. Inevitably, memes will come up. What is your perspective on Donald Trump? And as soon as you deviate from the narratives, and people may consider that they're not, following a mainstream narrative, but actually, often from our perspective, they are, because they're arguing over, which law is the best law to apply. Whether people should or should not be doing X, Y, or Z. And what they mean by that is that, if you agree with them, there should be a law against it. And the difference is that you've settled your mind on what it is that you're going to do, and you don't feel the urge to justify yourself and to get into a heavy debate with somebody at work, for example, that might be quite interested in economics. They might be familiar with Rothbard but disagree with him, um, and feel a lot of tension, and have to justify yourself, um, to them, feel sort of intellectually challenged, and frustrated and upset, on top of all of the other things that you're having to deal with. But rather to see what they're saying and where they're coming from, as part of this psychological pattern or picture. So for a lot of people, their role actually is that of enabler. They are uh, uh, they're recreating the way that they've been brought up, the way that the state has shaped and molded them to become enablers of the state. And that's really all they're doing, and that's really, in some ways, all you need to know. So it's a strange balance, because I don't take an anti-intellectual line like, shut down debate, don't debate things. Um, of course, if you feel a topic is interesting and you want to learn more about it, and you might well decide to have that particular debate if you feel the environment is conducive, and constructive and so forth. But if you detect that you're just being shut down, you're saying things like, well, are you sure that 9/11 was really, a terrorist operation? Or, would you consider that it was potentially an inside job? And you just get dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Then you could take that to heart. If you take pride in your work, in the particular job that you're doing. If you're a lawyer, your whole job revolves around producing evidence. You're paid to think and you're paid to speak articulately. And you might feel that you're on shaky ground, and being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist affects you more than perhaps if you were in a different kind of job. So you're able to see that, well, I'm talking here to an enabler, really, and I'm being gaslit over this issue.
I liked how you talked about the enabler, because that gives us a concrete example. And now, could you flip
Mm.
now over to the exit side? How would you exit from an enabler? And then what are ways that we exit from the state, so to speak?
Yeah. So, you might decide that this conversation is no longer constructive, and that the person that you're talking to, is isn't engaging with the actual details that you're, concerned with, whether it's to do with economics, um, the political environment, the cultural issues. Uh, they're insisting that men are women or women are men. Um, you see that as gaslighting. You see their role as enabler, and if you're being marginalized at work, you see that you're being made invisible, and or scapegoated. So when you recognize that that's what's happening, it's much easier for you to say, "Oh, well, it's interesting that you have that view, but that's not really my take." And you end the discussion, and you save your energy, uh, and you focus on, maybe I'll use that energy that I have that I didn't use up, defending myself at work or with my family, to to do something well, in the sense like what I've done with this framework. I now have the energy to publish a framework on an idea that I had that I think is important. But it might be, to research how I can, make my phone more private if that's important to you, how I can understand what this crypto is about. I've heard of Monero, but what is that? And I might just have a bit more time and energy and mental space to go into that, because I didn't spend, 2 hours on Telegram, trying to justify, you know, rejecting modern monetary theory. So I've made my life a lot simpler, and I've cleared space. In many ways, it's about clearing out the garbage, and making space for what's really important, what you want to focus on, which is your exit.
And I might add, exit doesn't have to be like the only key thing you do with it. You sort of implied it right there. You said that you're freeing up space, you're freeing up mental space, you're reducing your stress of not really understanding how things work. You're seeing it now rather clearly. And by seeing things clearly, to me anyway, it's gratifying and it is freeing and liberating. That means you now can put mental effort, thought, time, whatever, into things that aren't wasteful and toxic. If it's not necessarily exit because you can't afford it, you are afraid to do it, and you're not ready for it, that's fine. You're still in a better place because you understand things a bit better, and that itself is valuable. And I see that as one of the values in your work.
Yeah, and one of the ideas that I've come across is that a sense that anybody listening to this might feel, oh no, not another thing that I have to get my head around, and it is actually true. The way that I wrote it, it was designed to be a little bit more academically defensive. I originally wrote it in a much more accessible way, or I thought it was, but it was, it opened up a lot of attack vectors in terms of psychologizing politics, anthropomorphizing the larger world, these kinds of accusations. So I tightened it up a bit, and it might feel a little bit inaccessible in a way, but actually the core idea is relatively straightforward to follow. You don't need to really, I think, sweat over it too much. Just get the basic mechanisms and the basic roles in front of mind, and then apply it as you go through your daily life. If you listen to news stories on the radio, if you watch blogs, you read blogs, you listen to people on YouTube, and just ask yourself, does this fit into that particular framework? And take your time over it. It's not something you have to rush into. But I think that people will find that the more that they do that, the more that it will resonate with them. And in a sense, they will become the experts at the application because it will be meaningful for them and from where they're coming from. And I say this because of so many different kinds of conversations that I have with people about these issues. And I always find that the biggest problem is like, where are they coming from in the first place? And how much knowledge do they have, from the outset? And usually, it's very different to where I'm coming from, and I think where we're coming from in this community. And it's much easier for us to talk within this community, but how do we interface with the outside world? And that's where I've always had difficulty, and in a way, that's why I hope that this helps, to manage that, so that you can dive into an issue, but only where it really suits your purposes, without letting go of the overall aim of exiting the system.
And one of the other things that came out of it, and I'm not even sure you intended this, but for me it resonates because of my particular focus, and that is that it shows how there is another example of the weakness of statism. Now, if we go back to a narcissistic family dynamic, the narcissistic dynamic has a weakness to it, namely that it is vulnerable to truth, to the truth. Fundamentally, it requires its own, you might say, internal myths to exist and to persist, because nothing else can sustain that. It's the manipulation that it relies on, and that's you might say, a kind of a false premise, or it's a false method. And by being false, it's vulnerable. And so I see the direct connection with the state here. The state relies on the belief in political authority, and in this case, I've learned narcissistic type of techniques to keep it alive. That's all unhealthy, false, and in particular, vulnerable to the light of day. So to me, this is another exposure of the weaknesses of statism itself. In other words, truth works against it very much so. I don't suppose you intended that when you were writing, but it certainly comes out and is resonant. It resonates with me.
I absolutely did intend it. When I was just thinking that we have this great advantage that Larkin and Michael Humer and so forth take all the credit for, which is we hone straight in on the myth of the state. And the whole purpose of narcissism in the family environment and outside of it is to hide an unpalatable or sort of, indigestible truth. So it's covering up something that the family and the family environment wants to have hidden, and society in the broader environment wants hidden. So it came out of research into alcoholics and alcoholism and the effect of that on families. So that the hidden secret really was that one of the family members was a hardcore alcoholic, and so these mechanisms spring up as a way to manage the family's ongoing, the way that they get through day by day. That's where it comes from. So it's this hidden truth. Well, we know what the hidden truth is in relation to the state, and that is that it relies on violence as its ultimate fallback. So my theory is that, and I haven't explored this in the framework because I didn't want to, put too much in there, make it digestible. But I believe that that's where this springs from. This is the unpalatable truth that needs to be hidden, kept from view, and managed.
Exactly. And so let me ask this. You see a great deal of value in a person becoming aware, consciously aware of these particular narcissistic parallels with the state in order to arm them to, do whatever they can do to improve their own life, exit, whatever it may be. And I agree with that. Do you see it, though, as utterly causally necessary for them to increase their skepticism by focusing on these very techniques? Or if they merely get skeptical along the way in various other ways that are not as precise as this, but nonetheless cause them to get more skeptical of statism, what kind of value is there, if any, in that alone, if they're not fully, assuming they're not fully cognizant of your particular insights?
I think a while back, before I understood narcissism better in the psychological realm, I would have been more positive about that statement. But in my experience, and I've heard this subsequently from psychologists online and so forth, actually, without help, without understanding, in fact, it takes even more than understanding. It takes help, because even if you understand it, you'll be very isolated if you're trying to undertake a separation and then exit on your own. And that's why the sort of community that you're building is so important, and many others as well, because you need a kind of support environment in which people understand where you're coming from. So I've got to the point now where, and this was part of the motivation for creating the framework. It's really hard. I mean, when I say really hard, we're talking sort of impossibly hard, without being, dogmatic about it. Impossible is a very strong word. So, you could conceive of a way that it would be done otherwise, but really, you're making life very unnecessarily hard for yourself if you don't have what I describe as a compass and a map, and the support system to go with it. The framework provides that compass and map is the idea. Yeah.
We often think of help as coming from therapists, psychologists who help us, family members who've been through it, or friends who've been through it. And I suppose in the case of this, we're very much talking about people who are familiar with the foundation that you've presented, or at least fully understanding that there's a lot of psychology behind what the state does. And so at least we are prepared to be open to hearing these kind of descriptive analyses of how it actually works under the hood.
Yeah, but I think that, the framework only makes sense really to people that already buy into or very skeptical of the myth of the state. And the book sort of starts out with that premise. So to a wider world, I can only sort of hope that there's kind of through osmosis, through a much broader sort of weakening of the public consciousness in relation to the state, that it would seep out in that way. But the intended audience are our community. That's where it is designed to hit home first, and then potentially that would help the whole idea grow out into the wider world, and actually then help people who aren't sort of uh, anarchists and libertarians see it even when they're not anarchists and libertarians. But at this point in time, I know that it would be that's not my target audience, because it would land on deaf ears.
Understood. If let's speculate about this reaching, a decent number of already red-pilled libertarians / anarcho-capitalists. You would, of course, I assume, want them to personally get value out of it so that they themselves are in a better place and more able to use their energies efficiently and psychologically healthy ways. Beyond that, what would you have them do? What would you like to see them do? What would be your hope that they do with this material? More in the sense of
Well, I'm glad you asked, Mark, because one of my first moves on creating it was kind of obviously, in a way, to post it on the major forums, Black and Gold, Ron Paul, Agorism, and the other major forums in our domain, and it was very, I was very happy with the reception of the underlying idea. But because I had admitted that I had leveraged on AI to help me edit, conceive, research, put together, formulate the entire framework, it meant, Dave Smith as well, he's got a large Reddit, it meant that it's been banned. So straight out the gate, our community has effectively censored it. And it's one of the reasons that I was, very happy to have been invited by yourself, because trying to get, this framework in front of people is really hard, because people are coming to it with all kinds of, pre-existing ideas about the way that discourse should, unfold, how it should be done. And AI is presenting real challenges in that domain. And the irony is that in many ways, I completely agree with them. I understand entirely why they've done that. But I wrote an article to sort of counter it, which, the essence of it is, look, we've got AI now. Everyone's going to be using it. And by all means, apply it to my framework. I'm not expecting for a moment that people won't look at my framework and start trying to pull it apart immediately. And that's the way it should be. But they'll probably use AI to do it. So to some extent, if we don't leverage on these tools, well, we know who will be leveraging on these tools, and that's everyone who wants to take us in the opposite direction. So I think that we have to embrace new technology, just as you and I are doing now on YouTube. And you get a lot of people saying things like, "Isn't it terrible? People spend all this time on YouTube and social media." Well, we don't really think that, do we? Because we're hoping that people will be watching this. So it's if people want to approach a topic in an unintelligent way, they're going to do it, and they're going to watch cat videos on social media. But if we were to turn our backs on it just because that's the case, we would be shooting ourselves in the foot, effectively. And I think that there's an iteration of that that's happened. So I would appeal to some extent to any of those guys, if they're watching this, to to find a way to be more discerning about how this problem is managed, so that good ideas can still get through, whilst acknowledging I haven't spent a large proportion of my time curating, moderating online forums, and that a lot of work goes into that. And I understand, how difficult that must be, and it is a very useful service for us all. But yeah, I don't spend a lot of time on them for the reasons that I explained in the framework. So we've got to move on in a way.
Yes, that's exactly right. We're a good hour in, and I did not want to let you go without giving you a chance to discuss any topic related to this or not related to this that you wanted to kind of take some time with. I want to sort of hand it over to you for any topic that interests you.
Sure. I mean, I was prepared to go into a lot more detail about the background that I had that brought me to this point, but that's not a problem. I just thought there might be some things that would be of interest to people in that potted history. My main concern was actually getting my last point out about, I hope that I can still disseminate the message as broadly and as widely as possible, despite my experiences on the forums. Yeah, and no, just I think really then just to thank you, Mark, for the sort of service, as it were, that you provide us all with.
I'd encourage you to continue your efforts here, because I could vouch for it. It takes time. These things, we're going to run into roadblocks every step of the way. And if we're committed to what we're doing and we're enthusiastic and passionate about it, you got to keep going. You just got to keep going, try different things. And you never know when something's going to click. So I'll certainly push it myself, and I encourage you to keep going, because
Thank you.
I see great value in what you've done here.
Well, thank you, and you've really given me a motivational boost. You've really helped me in my own motivation.
Good. That's good to hear. I'm glad. And again, it's a great place to wrap up, folks. I really strongly encourage you to check out the show notes for Philip's content and to follow him. And it is a bounty of unique and helpful material, and he makes it easily digestible. Philip, thank you so much for joining me today on the White Pill Box.
Thank you, Mark.
And as always, folks, thank you to everyone out there as well so much. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.